In the heart of Tirana, where narrow streets twisted like the alleys of a forgotten city, power was measured not by wealth alone, but by the quiet control one could command. It was in these shadows that Arben Kodra first learned the rules of survival. Born into a modest neighborhood where whispers carried more weight than loud voices, Arben's childhood was shaped by observation, patience, and understanding human behavior with a precision few could match. By the time he was in his early 20s, he had already begun building a reputation, not one that drew attention with loud confrontations, but one that earned respect and, more importantly, fear without a single shot fired. Arben's family had been ordinary, yet they carried a subtle strength that the young boy inherited. His father, a quiet man who managed a small construction business, often told him, "The world is ruled not by those who shout, but by those who understand the silence between words." Arben took this to heart, observing everything around him: the deals struck behind closed doors, the rivalries hidden behind smiles, and the subtle signs that indicated loyalty or betrayal. It was in this environment that Arben's mind became his weapon, sharper than any knife, more decisive than any gun. In his early ventures, Arben started small. He would mediate disputes between local traders, solve neighborhood problems, and quietly ensure that debts were repaid. But unlike others who sought recognition, Arben moved in whispers. The local gangs, territorial and ambitious, watched him closely. They were cautious, unsure whether this young man was a threat or an ally. Arben never sought confrontation. His power came from knowledge, strategy, and timing. Every interaction, every word he spoke, every choice he made, was calculated to place him where influence could quietly expand. By the age of 25, Arben had begun assembling a small group of trusted allies. These were not men who flaunted violence or notoriety. They were observant, discreet, and loyal. They moved silently, blending into the fabric of the city, yet their presence was unmistakable to those who knew to look. It was a network built on intelligence, mutual respect, and a shared understanding. Power was gained, not through fear alone, but through precision, patience, and the careful orchestration of events that others could not see. Tirana itself was a city of contrasts. Luxury hotels and neon lights illuminated one side, while the other hid forgotten corners where opportunity and danger existed side by side. Arben knew every alley, every business, every subtle clue that might hint at a rival's movement or a potential betrayal. His ability to read people, predict outcomes, and act without drawing attention became legendary. Word spread quietly, and by the time he entered his 30s, he had effectively controlled multiple operations across the city, everything from small trade mediation to underground networks that operated beyond the view of law enforcement. No one could truly challenge him without risking exposure, and he ensured that challenge was rarely even considered. Yet Arben's rise was not without subtle tension. Rival gangs existed, each with its own ambitions and codes. Most underestimated him because he avoided public display, never seeking headlines or showing dominance through violence. They didn't realize that while they relied on fear, Arben relied on understanding, leverage, and a network of information that gave him insight into their moves long before they even acted. It was a chess game, and Arben always saw the board 2 steps ahead. It was during this time that Arben established his unspoken rule: loyalty was everything, but trust had to be earned, and betrayal, no matter how small, would carry consequences far beyond the initial act. He never shouted threats, never boasted about power. He simply ensured that anyone who observed closely understood that every decision he made, every action he took, was deliberate. The city began to recognize his influence, not in headlines or social media, but in the quiet compliance of others who realized that opposing him was not worth the risk. By the end of this chapter of his life, Arben Kodra was no longer just a young man with ambition. He had become a silent king, a man who controlled everything in the shadows. The city moved according to patterns he understood, alliances shifted at his subtle guidance, and the streets whispered his name with a mix of respect and caution. But as with every rise, there was always a shadow waiting, an inevitable challenge that would test even the most calculated power. And for Arben, the real test, the moment when every choice, every alliance, and every secret would matter was still to come. By the time Arben Kodra had established himself as a quiet yet undeniable force in Tirana, his ambitions quietly extended beyond the city limits. Albania's underworld was fragmented, a collection of local gangs, clandestine operations, and family-run networks that operated independently, often clashing in subtle ways. To anyone else, the system might have seemed chaotic, but Arben saw it as a map lines of opportunity connecting pockets of influence, channels that could be quietly synchronized, and alliances that could be leveraged without violence. Arben's expansion began not with grand gestures or public confrontations, but with meticulous observation and careful introduction. He traveled across the country, meeting local figures in towns where his name had not yet reached. He did not flaunt power. Instead, he listened, understood the ambitions and frustrations of local leaders, and identified mutual interests. His proposition was always the same: cooperation over conflict, strategy over chaos, and shared growth over unnecessary confrontation. Most found the idea appealing because it minimized risk while maximizing potential gain. Those who resisted quietly learned that opposition was not in their best interest, not through intimidation, but through the subtle influence of information, insight, and well-timed action. By forming this network, Arben created a structure rarely seen in the Albanian underworld. Unlike the fragmented systems around him, which relied on fear, force, and territorial disputes, Arben's organization operated like a quiet, invisible machine. Each member understood their role, each ally recognized the value of discretion, and each operation was conducted in a way that minimized exposure. It was a delicate balance: influence without attention, control without display. Those who observed too closely could sense the presence of power, but never its full scope. Arben's strategy relied heavily on human intelligence. He carefully cultivated relationships with those who could provide insight into rival movements, upcoming conflicts, or emerging opportunities. Careers, traders, and even local law enforcement became part of the larger picture, not because he coerced them, but because they recognized that Arben's network offered stability, subtle protection, and mutual advantage. With these connections, he gained foresight into events that others would only react to later, placing him steps ahead in a world where one wrong move could end everything. Despite the calm and calculated nature of his expansion, rivalries were inevitable. Certain factions, threatened by Arben's rise, began testing boundaries, but he handled these challenges with precision, neutralizing threats without public confrontation. A mismanaged rumor here, a carefully timed suggestion there, and potential opposition dissolved quietly, often before it fully materialized. His reputation grew, not as a man who struck with weapons, but as a figure who understood human behavior, negotiation, and timing better than anyone else in the region. One of the most critical aspects of this expansion was trust. Arben never allowed unchecked loyalty. Each ally, each connection, was observed, assessed, and understood over time. Mistakes or signs of betrayal, however minor, were noted. It was not fear that maintained order, but the unspoken understanding that loyalty was invaluable and that Arben's awareness of every movement left no room for error. This careful curation of associates allowed him to manage a growing empire that spanned towns and regions, each connected through a web of relationships, knowledge, and mutual dependence. At the same time, Arben remained deeply aware of the fragility of his position. Growth created visibility, and visibility created risk. He avoided the mistakes of those who had risen too quickly, boasting publicly, engaging in reckless confrontations, or allowing personal pride to overshadow strategy. Each step he took was deliberate, measured, and designed to strengthen the network while remaining invisible to outsiders. In this way, his empire expanded silently, like a shadow spreading across the landscape, touching every corner without drawing unwanted attention. As the network grew, Arben's influence reached not only the streets and towns, but also the perception of the Albanian underworld itself. Rumors circulated of a man who controlled outcomes without ever raising his voice, who anticipated moves long before they occurred, and whose presence could be felt even when he was absent. People began to speak of him in hushed tones, acknowledging that this quiet figure had changed the rules of the game. Those who once relied on intimidation alone began to reconsider their methods, realizing that strategy, foresight, and discretion were now more powerful than force. By the end of this chapter in Arben's story, his empire had grown beyond a single city. He had forged alliances across Albania, understood the motivations and weaknesses of rivals, and created a network that allowed him to influence events silently but decisively. Yet, despite his accomplishments, the world he had built was delicate. One misstep, one misplaced trust, or one betrayal could unravel everything he had worked to create. And in the shadows, where power was often measured by patience and foresight, an unseen force was already preparing to test the limits of even the most calculated empire. Even the most calculated empires face shadows. For Arben Kodra, the shadow came in the form of two rival factions quietly consolidating power in the outskirts of Tirana. They were not reckless street gangs seeking chaos. They were organized, strategic, and ambitious. Two silent forces with histories as complex as Arben's own. While Arben operated in calculated discretion, these rivals relied on networks of intimidation, whispers, and loyalty forged through fear. The stage was set for a confrontation, though at this stage it remained invisible to most eyes. Arben had known about the existence of these factions long before their first public maneuver. His intelligence network, built from trusted allies, informants, and carefully cultivated connections across Albania, had alerted him to their movements. Unlike others who might have acted impulsively, Arben understood the value of patience. He observed patterns, analyzed alliances, and waited for the exact moment to intervene, not with force, but with precision strategy. Every choice, every meeting, and every word was carefully designed to maintain his position, while studying the intentions of those who might one day challenge him. The first sign of escalation came subtly. Shipments intercepted, minor disputes that appeared coincidental but were orchestrated. The factions were testing boundaries, probing the influence of Arben's network. He did not react immediately. Instead, he monitored the situation, allowing their actions to reveal intentions, weaknesses, and the loyalty of his subordinates. In the world of the Albanian underworld, information was power, and Arben had mastered the art of gathering it without drawing attention. One evening, a trusted ally, Lirim, approached Arben with news of a planned gathering of the two rival factions in a town outside Tirana. The meeting was ostensibly for negotiation between the groups, but Arben, through careful deduction, recognized the deeper purpose: alliance building against his influence. A challenge had been issued, not overtly, but through subtle maneuvers, coded gestures, and hints visible only to those who could read between the lines. Arben did not panic. He did not issue threats. Instead, he prepared. He organized his own network of observers, ensuring he had eyes in the right places without revealing his presence. His plan was not to confront directly, but to create a position of leverage. By understanding their strategy before they acted, Arben could influence outcomes without firing a single shot. Timing, subtle pressure, and the manipulation of perception were his tools. Tools far more effective than violence in a game where patience defines success. The rival factions, unaware of Arben's insight, continued their maneuvering. They miscalculated, assuming his expansion had left him vulnerable, that ambition had distracted him from the subtleties of Albanian power dynamics. This misjudgment became evident as small disruptions within their ranks began to appear, alliances shifting quietly, key supporters reconsidering loyalty, and operational errors that went unnoticed by most but were carefully noted by Arben. By the time they realized they had been observed, it was too late. The silent hand of the Shadow King had already moved. Despite his advantage, Arben knew that victories of this kind were fragile. He had seen overconfidence ruin even the most powerful leaders. His strategy relied not on crushing opponents, but on patience, observation, and leverage. By turning the rival faction's own distrust against them, he created internal tension that weakened their ability to act collectively. Soon, whispers of uncertainty within their ranks began to spread, creating doubt, suspicion, and hesitation. Power that once seemed unified now fractured quietly under its own weight. As the days passed, Arben extended offers of subtle alliances to some members of the rival factions, emphasizing benefits over threats. A few accepted, not because they feared him, but because his logic made sense. Cooperation now offered more reward than opposition. Those who refused remained isolated, and their capacity to challenge him diminished with every careful maneuver. By the end of this phase, the rival factions had not been destroyed, but they had been neutralized without confrontation. Arben's shadow now extended over them, his influence quiet yet undeniable. Yet, as always in the world he had built, tension lingered. While Arben had neutralized the immediate threat, the very act of expansion and influence had drawn attention. Some members of his own network, ambitious and curious, began to test boundaries, while whispers of dissent and envy emerged even in places he considered loyal. The shadow rivals were no longer the only concern. Arben knew the fragile nature of power. The closer one approached the summit, the more dangerous every shadow became. And in the underworld, every shadow carried a secret, every secret held the potential for betrayal, and every betrayal could unravel even the most careful empire. By the end of this chapter, Arben had proven the effectiveness of his silent influence, mastering both observation and manipulation to secure his empire. Yet the story hinted at the future, unseen forces, ambitions within his network, and the inevitability of human error were quietly converging. The shadows were watching, and for the first time, Arben sensed that his most formidable challenge might not come from rivals outside, but from the very empire he had carefully constructed. Even the most carefully built empire carries an invisible risk, the quiet ambition of those closest to power. Arben Kodra, who had risen to dominate the Albanian underworld with precision and foresight, had long understood that loyalty could never be assumed. Yet, even he could not foresee the subtle fracture forming within his inner circle, a fracture that would test everything he had built. Among his closest associates was Dren, a man who had risen with Arben from the earliest days. Quiet, intelligent, and fiercely capable, Dren had earned a position of trust that few others could claim. He managed key operations, oversaw communications, and served as a bridge between Arben and the extended network of allies. Arben relied on Dren's judgment, valuing his insight and discretion. But ambition, subtle and almost imperceptible, had begun to Dren had observed the power Arben held, the respect he commanded, and the untouchable reputation he had cultivated. A small seed of envy had taken root, a desire to carve his own name in the shadows. The first signs were almost invisible: misplaced reports, delayed communications, and choices that subtly undermined Arben's strategy. At first Arben dismissed them as mistakes. Even the most loyal could err under pressure. Yet the pattern grew too deliberate to ignore. Dren was testing boundaries, probing for weaknesses, and quietly seeking allies among the peripheral members of Arben's network. The genius of this betrayal was its subtlety. It was impossible to confront without exposing both the betrayer and the internal vulnerability of the empire. Arben's response was measured. He observed, gathering evidence without revealing suspicion. He knew that confronting Dren prematurely could spark panic or accelerate plans that were already in motion. Every interaction, every decision Dren made, was carefully noted. Patterns emerged, revealing not just small acts of defiance, but strategic attempts to influence others, shift loyalties, and prepare for a moment when he could act decisively. The tension within the network began to rise quietly. Trusted allies, sensing the slight disturbances, questioned decisions they had once followed without hesitation. Arben maintained his composure, showing confidence and calm, while subtly reinforcing loyalty among the remaining members. He did not act with anger, did not issue threats, nor reveal the suspicion that had taken root. His strategy relied on patience and precision, to allow the betrayer to reveal himself fully, so that the consequences would serve as both correction and warning. The betrayal reached its peak when Dren attempted to negotiate secretly with one of the rival factions introduced earlier. This was a risky move, potentially catastrophic. Yet Arben had already anticipated it. The careful observation of every meeting, every message, and every gesture allowed him to intercept the negotiation before it could destabilize the network. By orchestrating a response that appeared coincidental to outsiders, Arben neutralized the immediate threat without revealing his full awareness. Dren was left exposed, not publicly, but in the understanding that his ambitions had been carefully observed and countered. Arben confronted the betrayal indirectly, in a private meeting that carried no anger, no accusation, only calm analysis. He presented facts, patterns, and outcomes that left Dren with no room for denial or excuse. The lesson was clear: loyalty was not optional, and deception, no matter how subtle, would never go unnoticed. Dren, understanding both the brilliance and the reach of Arben's strategy, realized he had been outmaneuvered without a single blow, without public humiliation. He retreated, cautious and aware, yet the trust he once held had been irreparably altered. This episode sent ripples through the empire. The inner circle understood that Arben's control was not based on fear alone, nor on the loyalty of allies without scrutiny. It was a demonstration of awareness, foresight, and the quiet but unyielding power of observation. Any thoughts of betrayal were tempered by the understanding that every move within the network could be seen, analyzed, and countered long before consequences could unfold. Yet, while Arben had successfully managed the first serious challenge from within, he also understood the lesson this betrayal delivered. No empire, no matter how cleverly constructed, was immune to internal ambition. Every ally carried potential risk. Every loyalty required careful maintenance, and even a man as brilliant and disciplined as Arben could not control the unpredictable nature of human desire. By the end of this chapter, Arben remained in control, but the shadow of betrayal had left its mark. It was a reminder that power, even when exercised with precision, always carries vulnerability. And as the empire expanded, as rivals plotted, and as internal tensions simmered, Arben knew that the most dangerous threats were no longer outside in the rival factions or the streets of Tirana, but inside, in the minds of those he once trusted most. Even the most calculated empires, built on observation, patience, and strategy, have their moments of fragility. For Arben Kodra, the betrayal of a trusted ally had been a warning, but it was only the beginning. As his empire stretched across Albania, subtle cracks began to appear, both from rival factions and within his own network. The very foundations he had carefully constructed were now under pressure, testing the limits of his control. The rival factions, previously cautious and restrained, sensed the change. Whispers of discontent, small mistakes, and minor internal conflicts gave them the impression that Arben's influence had limits. They moved carefully, probing for weaknesses, attempting to draw members of his network to their side. Arben, aware of their subtle maneuvers, continued to observe, yet even he could not anticipate the perfect timing with which they would strike, coordinated, silent, and precise, designed to exploit the human weaknesses that no network, however intelligent, could fully eliminate. The first signs appeared in minor operations: a shipment delayed, a miscommunication among key allies, and the calculated movement of resources that did not align with Arben's strategy. At first glance, these incidents seemed isolated, but Arben recognized a pattern forming. The rival factions were exploiting ambition, frustration, and curiosity within his empire, manipulating perception and creating confusion. While Arben's foresight remained unmatched, the unfolding events revealed that even the most vigilant leader could be forced into reactive measures when multiple forces acted in concert. The pressure grew when Dren, the man whose betrayal had been contained earlier, began to test the boundaries again. Though he had been temporarily restrained, he had not been eliminated, and his ambition had festered. Coordinating secretly with members of the rival factions, He initiated subtle disruptions that could destabilize even the most careful operations. Arben realized that the betrayal was no longer isolated. It had become a chain reaction, rippling through the network in ways that demanded immediate yet precise responses. Arben's response was a testament to his genius. He did not act with panic or anger. Instead, he reinforced communication channels, subtly realigned alliances, and quietly reminded each member of their loyalty and responsibility. Every action was deliberate, every word calculated. He sought to restore balance without triggering open conflict, relying on influence and strategy rather than intimidation. Yet, the realization was undeniable. His empire, which had seemed untouchable, was vulnerable, not to force, not to visibility, but to the unpredictable nature of human desire, ambition, and fear. As the tension mounted, the underworld began to notice the shift. Those who once whispered his name with respect now debated the possibilities. Could the Silent King truly maintain control over such a sprawling network? Were cracks appearing in the armor that had always seemed impenetrable? The subtle signs of disarray became topics of speculation, fueling further pressure and uncertainty. Arben, aware of the growing perception, intensified his observation, knowing that even perception could become reality if left unchecked. In the midst of this turmoil, Arben faced a personal challenge. His decision-making, once calm and precise, was now constantly tested. Every minor misstep could be exploited, every hesitation amplified by those waiting in the shadows. The burden of control, already heavy, grew heavier with each passing day. Even as he manipulated outcomes in his favor, he recognized that unpredictability had entered his empire, not through force or failure, but through human nature itself. By the middle of this chapter, Arben understood that the greatest threats were no longer external alone. The combined weight of ambition, envy, and misaligned loyalty was creating a perfect storm. While his intelligence network still provided critical insight, he realized that some elements could never be fully controlled. Human desire, particularly when influenced by resentment or ambition, introduced variables beyond any strategic calculation. The final days of this phase were marked by subtle, but unmistakable tension. Communication slowed in key areas, minor alliances faltered, and the rival factions continued to encroach, not openly, but through calculated moves designed to undermine confidence and create distraction. Arben remained composed, yet even he could sense that the empire he had spent years building was moving closer to a tipping point. The shadow of betrayal, once isolated, now stretched across every corner of his network. By the end of Chapter 5, the Silent King retained control, but the inevitability of his fall loomed closer. The underworld, patient and observant, had begun to exploit vulnerabilities that no brilliance could entirely mitigate. Arben's empire, built on strategy, loyalty, and foresight, had reached its most precarious point. The shadows that had always served him now whispered of inevitability, and though he remained silent, calculating, and aware, even he understood that the forces converging around him might soon overcome the careful balance he had maintained for so long. For years, Arben Kodra had moved through the shadows with unparalleled precision. He had built an empire that extended across Albania, manipulated rival factions, neutralized internal threats, and commanded loyalty through strategy rather than fear. Yet even the most calculated plans are subject to the unpredictability of human ambition, and even the Silent King could not foresee the perfect storm that was forming within his carefully constructed world. It began subtly, as it always did. Minor miscommunications, delayed reports, and unexplained absences within his network created small openings. While individually these might have seemed insignificant, together they formed a pattern that could no longer be ignored. The rival factions had grown bold, capitalizing on cracks within Arben's network, and Dren, the former ally whose ambition had been previously restrained, now moved with quiet audacity, orchestrating a chain of disruptions that reached deeper than anyone suspected. Arben realized the inevitable. He had underestimated the combination of external pressure and internal ambition. Even with perfect information, human unpredictability could challenge the most disciplined empire. He acted quickly, attempting to realign alliances and reinforce loyalty, but the network he had built with years of patience now contained unseen fractures too significant to mend. Decisions that once commanded certainty now required negotiation, subtle persuasion, and hope, resources far weaker than control. The rival factions struck with careful timing. Operations he had once managed flawlessly faltered under pressure. Allies hesitated when action was needed, and critical decisions were delayed by whispers of doubt. Dren moved strategically, feeding misinformation and manipulating perception to destabilize confidence. In a world where timing, precision, and unity had always defined success, this coordinated disruption created chaos without a single act of overt violence. Arben recognized the fall was not immediate. It unfolded like a silent tide, gradual yet unstoppable. By the time the consequences became visible to outsiders, it was too late. The empire, once quiet, orderly, and controlled, began to fragment. Allies shifted loyalties, rivals capitalized on hesitation, and operations collapsed under the weight of miscommunication. The power that had seemed unshakable for years now existed in fragments, each piece vulnerable and exposed. What made the fall particularly tragic was its inevitability. Arben had foreseen almost every threat in his rise to power. Yet the combination of subtle ambition, human error, and external opportunism had created a situation beyond even his control. There was no confrontation, no dramatic battle, only the quiet realization that the empire he had devoted his life to had eroded from within. Like a shadow dissipating at dawn, Arben's influence receded, leaving him to witness the consequences of the ambition, loyalty, and human nature he had always so carefully balanced. In the aftermath, Tirana felt a shift in the underworld. The silent king, once a name spoken with caution and respect, was now a memory, a lesson for those who believed that intellect, foresight, and discretion alone could secure permanence. Rival factions expanded, internal betrayals became common knowledge, and the city adjusted to the absence of the careful influence that had once maintained balance. Yet even in defeat, Arben's legacy endured, not as a triumphant ruler, but as a study of control, ambition, and the precarious nature of power. As he retreated from the city, leaving behind both the empire he had built and the network he had cultivated, Arben understood the ultimate lesson: no empire, no matter how intelligent, is immune to human unpredictability. Ambition cannot be completely controlled, loyalty cannot be fully guaranteed, and even the most meticulous planning cannot account for every variable. The silent king had been toppled, not through violence, but through the convergence of ambition, error, and timing forces as inevitable as time itself. The final hours were marked by quiet reflection. Arben walked alone through the streets of Tirana, the neon lights and narrow alleys no longer a playground of influence, but a landscape of lessons learned. The empire had fallen, but knowledge remained, a reminder that power, patience, and observation are formidable, yet fragile. The underworld would continue, rivals would rise and fall, but the story of the silent king would endure as a lesson in strategy, foresight, and the fragile balance of human ambition. And so, in the shadows where he once controlled everything, Arben Kodra vanished, not with a dramatic end, but with the quiet inevitability of someone who had learned too late that even the most silent, calculated empire cannot withstand the combined weight of ambition, betrayal, and human unpredictability. The city moved on, whispers of his name fading, yet the lesson remained clear: even the most powerful fall, and silence alone cannot secure eternity.